Hey there, night owls. Welcome back to the quiet corner of the internet, where we tuck ourselves into history's most ridiculous ideas that somehow worked. Tonight, let's drift into the soft lapping of lagoon water, the creak of old wood, and the faint whisper of salt air through narrow canals. We're visiting Venice. Is that impossible city that everyone says is romantic, until you realize it's basically an architectural panic attack built on soggy sticks. You might know her as the City of Bridges, the Queen of the Age, or that place where cruise ships used to photobomb centuries-old palazzos before locals collectively said, enough. But back when it was just a collection of terrified refugees escaping Germanic invasions, no one looked at a swamp and thought, yeah, that's prime real estate. And yet, they built Italiano, a city that shouldn't exist. Floating not. Really floating, but close enough on water. So tonight, we're going to find out how a bunch of medieval engineers decided to fight geology and somehow win. So, grab your tea, dim the lights. Let's sink gently into the story of Venice's most audacious engineering. Let's rewind about 1500 years. The Western Roman Empire is collapsing. Everyone's panicking. And up north, the Lombards are rampaging across Italy like they own the place, which, frankly, they soon did. The inhabitants of the Veneto region had a problem. No walls, no armies, no chance. So, they ran. Where? To the marshes. Because if you can't defeat your enemies, maybe just confuse them into turning around. These refugees fled into the lagoon, 50 or so mudflats and tiny islands, surrounded by brackish water that smelled exactly like defeat and algae. The early settlers built on timber huts, raised on stakes hammered deep into the sediment. It wasn't glamorous. Imagine living ankle deep in water surrounded by mosquitoes and manufacturing salt for trade just to get by. A seagull utopia. Eventually, though survival turned into ambition, people realized that by huddling amid the muck, they'd accidentally hit on a perfect defense strategy. No invading army wanted to slog through miles of knee-deep sludge to get to them. Even the water was on their side, quite literally. So, Venice began. Slowly, stubbornly, and in ways nobody else would have dared. Now, let's talk construction. You might think Venice is floating. It's not. It pretends to float, which is impressive, like pretending your leaky bathroom floor is actually a houseboat. The whole city sits atop Milianzias. Milianza wooden piles driven deep into the muddy seabed. In any other situation, those timbers would rot away in a few decades. But Venice found a strange loophole in nature. Wood doesn't decay without oxygen. Down there, trapped under layers of mud and silt, the oak and alder piles basically mummified themselves. So the foundations of Venice aren't stone, but underwater petrified forests. Above that came plinths of Istrian, stone-hard, white, and weirdly waterproof. First, it was just a brick. Then, boom, an entire civilization. Imagine this, a medieval crew, barefoot in the muddy tide, pushing logs into the lagoon, probably swearing in a bunch of different languages, and somehow holding it together long enough to produce buildings that still stand today. Modern engineers still can't decide if it was genius or madness, probably bought. But if that was the only trick, it wouldn't be very Venetian. Venice didn't just build on water, it also made water part of its structure. The entire city became a balancing act between sea and stone, where canals replaced streets, and tides worked as both sewer and transportation network, an early example of multifunctionality. Medieval edition. The canals themselves were carefully managed. Some were deepened for gondolas and trade boats. Others served as slow-moving drainage systems. The Venetians even invented tide gates rudimentary, wooden contraptions that managed water levels before pumps existed. And because this is Venice, everything had to look beautiful while functioning. The Palazzo Ducali wasn't just a defensive fortress. It was a swagger statement made of pink marble that screamed, "We live in a swamp, and yet we outshine your castles." As the city grew, controlling weight became a matter of survival. Venetian architects knew better than to put solid stone roofs on their houses, so they built with airy interiors, wooden ceilings, and layered facades that gave the illusion of heaviness without the actual stress. That's why Venetian Gothic is so distinct: tall, light, with delicate tracery, and seemingly weightless ornamentation. It's not just an artistic quirk, it's literal structural anxiety turned into beauty. And while we're on the subject of anxiety, let's mention subsidence. Venice has been sinking slowly since, well, forever. The city's been lowering itself millimeter by millimeter every year, partly because of its soft mud foundations, partly because humans kept removing groundwater like it was an all-you-can-eat buffet. In the 20th century, they finally realized, oh right, maybe we shouldn't drain the aquifers under our 1,200-year-old floating miracle. But by then, the damage was done. The city had sunk about 9 inches. Still, 9 inches over a millennium is not bad for something built on logs and prayers. Let's float over to another bit of Venetian Ginasora dilution, depending on your tolerance for civic bravado. The Republic of Venice loved showing off. It wasn't enough to survive in the lagoon. It had to dominate trade across the Mediterranean. The Venetians engineered entire fleets using their unique environment as advantage. Their shipyards, the arsenal, were basically the world's first industrial assembly line. Ships were built modularly by teams of specialists, with precision that freaked out everyone from Byzantines to Ottomans. At one point, they could supposedly produce a fully armed galley in a single day. This wasn't myth. Henry III of France visited and nearly had an existential crisis watching them at work. Imagine rows of artisans in controlled chaos, each section hammering, chiseling, roping, and pitching tar. While surrounded by canals that ferried materials in and out, the arsenal was Venice's heartbeat, a pulsing machine that gave birth to the maritime empire. And yet, this efficiency grew out of the same improbable landscape: marsh, mud, and silt. You can see a theme forming here. Venice took limitations and turned them into the absence of land meant no horses, which meant no stables, which meant fewer smells to ruin the air, but also no farmland. So Venetians imported everything. Managing logistics centuries before supply chain was a trendy phrase. They stored grain in specially engineered warehouses built to resist humidity. The Fondaco dei Tedeschi, for instance, used lead linings and raised flooring to protect goods from floods. Practical, but also theatrical, because merchants admired wealth best when it came with columns. And the bridges, those elegant little arches everyone photographs were once made of wood, replaced gradually with stone as fortunes grew. Each bridge became a quiet symbol of confidence, saying, yes, this mud won't swallow us. We're building permanence here. Perhaps the most poetic part of all this is how Venice made peace with water rather than fighting it. Instead of blocking tides, they learned their rhythms, building houses that rose with staircases descending directly to the canal edge. Flooding wasn't a disaster, it was just a seasonal inconvenience, like allergy season, but wetter. Even today, when Acqua Alta floods San Marcos Square, locals wade through it with resigned grace. It not that they don't notice it that they've inherited centuries of quiet acceptance, that their city is always halfway between drowning and dazzling. And that's kind of the whole Venetian philosophy. Coexist with chaos, as long as it looks good in the light of sunset. We'll leave things here for tonight, right where the lagoon glistens and history hums beneath its surface. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into what kept Venice alive for so long: the secret systems beneath the waterline, the anti-flooding magic, the weird urban logic that made engineers lose sleep for centuries, and maybe a few salty political dramas just for seasoning. So for now, close your eyes, listen to the quiet lapping of imaginary canals, and dream of a city that shouldn't have survived, but somehow peacefully did. All right, settle back in. Let us pick up our slow drift through Venice, where the water glittered like poetry and the plumbing resembled a puzzle designed by someone half drunk on salt air. By now, our imaginary gondola is gliding between those quiet stone walls. And if you dip your hand into the canal, please don't. But imagine you'd touch the true secret of Venetian engineering, because what keeps this city alive isn't the rooftops or T-Marble or even the dazzling view. It's the invisible network underneath. Venice survives because of an endless battle with water, not to defeat it, but to dance with it. Every rising tide, every gust of Adriatic wind, triggers a kind of mechanical symphony between pumps, barriers, and pure Venetian stubbornness. Let's start under the stones. When medieval Venetians realized their city was, technically speaking, built on perishable materials in a tidal marsh, they didn't panic. Instead, they developed one of the strangest maintenance rituals in history: continuous underwater care. Foundations were checked, piles were reinforced with new logs, and sediments were managed like they were part of the civic architecture. Canals weren't just waterways, they were arteries that had to be dredged regularly. If the canals choked on silt, the city literally stopped breathing. So they created a kind of aquatic cleaning schedule. Each sestiere or neighborhood was responsible for maintaining its local canals. Crews scooped out muck, reinforced embankments, and ensured water kept moving. The process was noisy, smelly, and absolutely vital. Imagine trying to fix your basement's foundation while standing knee-deep in the 14th century, using tools made of wood. That's Venetian perseverance in a nutshell. And speaking of tides, let's talk about Acqua Alta. Those famous floods that turned St. Mark's Square into a shallow pool aren't exactly new. They've been happening since before the Basilica had its first pigeon problem. The sea level naturally rises during certain winter winds, called the Sirocco, which pushes water from the Adriatic into the lagoon. Combine that with atmospheric pressure drops, and suddenly Venice turns into a mirror. For centuries, Venetians did nothing to stop it. They simply adapted their buildings. Ground floors were treated like sacrificial zones, paved with easily replaceable stones or used for storage. You never put your fine tapestries downstairs unless you enjoyed soggy textiles. Even today, many palazzi still bear watermarks centuries old, like quiet badges of survival. Now, modern Venice has something more high-tech. The Mose Project. Yes, named after Moses, who famously parted waters. Because Venetians don't do subtlety. Mose is a vast system of flood barriers, 78 massive gates anchored to the seabed across the lagoonous inlets. When tides threaten to overwhelm the city, the gates rise, blocking the incoming sea. In theory, it's Venice's ultimate shield. In practice, it is a blend of brilliant engineering and the kind of bureaucratic headache that would make even a saint sigh. Construction started in 2003, with promises of completion in 10 years. Fast forward through delays, scandals, and endless technical tweaks, and it finally became operational, sort of, in the 2020s. The ambition was enormous, to save an entire city without touching its delicate soul. And despite the mess, it works. When the barriers rise, the city stays dry. For a few hours, at least. Then the sea waits, patient and ancient, ready to return. But here is the odd thing about Venice's fight with water. The danger isn't just from outside, it's also from within. Every building exerts pressure on the lagoon bed, pushing ever so slightly into its muddy cushion. Over time, that sinking compounded by groundwater extraction caused subsidence, a polite geological term for slow-motion despair. By the 1900s, the city was quietly descending, centimeter by centimeter. Then factor in global sea level rise, and the math gets grim. The solution? Turn off the pumps and let the natural balance restore the water table, which mostly worked until climate change came along and said, "Nice try." These days, engineers use precise monitoring systems to track the city's tilt. Certain bell towers lean more than their architects might have appreciated, and restoration experts occasionally inject cement into soil layers to rebalance them. Think of it as geological Botox. Temporary, but impressive. Meanwhile, inside the buildings, water continues its subtle daily invasion. Salt creeps up through porous walls, crystallizing beneath aging plaster. This process, known charmingly as capillary rise, is the quiet assassin of Venetian architecture. Over time, it eats away brick and binding mortar, leaving elegant scars on delicate facades. Venetian conservators, ever inventive, developed humidity management systems and heating panels to gently dry walls. Some palaces even use sensor networks now, blending Renaissance flair with Wi-Fi-era anxiety. It's poetic coordination 16th century frescoes whispering above 21st century technology, humming beneath the old and new, both pretending this is normal. Let's drift farther down, below the visible waterline, into the lagoon itself. If you picture Venice from space, the city looks like a cluster of fossilized coral surrounded by a shallow, shifting sea. But the lagoon isn't static, it's alive. It breathes with the tides, morphing between sandbanks, marshes, and open flats, maintaining it as part of the city's never-ending duty. Since medieval times, Venetians controlled the lagoon by regulating its rivers. Too much sediment flow from the mainland, and you get swamp instead of water. Too little, and the barrier islands erode away, turning the lagoon into open sea. So they engineered canals and diversions to fine-tune river inputs. That's right. While most cities just reacted to nature, Venice literally redesigned its local ecosystem, not to dominate it, but to preserve the fragile equilibrium that let it exist. At some point, it's hard to tell where engineering ends and philosophy begins. Venice wasn't built to conquer its environment. It was built to compromise with it. A kind of architectural truce. Every stone placed was an act of negotiation. How much pressure, how much weight, how much water could be tolerated before nature retaliated? And somehow, despite everything, wars, plagues, Napoleon, rising seas, and mass tourism, the city still floats. Not because it defies reason, but because it fully embraces absurdity. Perhaps the secret ingredient isn't technology, but faith, not in the divine, but in maintenance. Venice doesn't survive. It endures through constant care because it has no other option. As the moonlight ripples across our imaginary canal, you can almost hear the city sighing, a little weary, a little proud. Beneath its beauty lies centuries of mud, machinery, and mistakes turned into marvels. In the next part, we'll drift above the surface again to how Venice built not just a city, but a civilization of mirrors and ceremony, a place where engineering became politics and politics became theater. So, for tonight, keep floating somewhere between dream and decay. The lagoon will wait for us. Welcome back, wanderer. The city's quiet tonight. The water's still doing that thing where it gently slaps against old stone, as if reminding everyone who's boss. And above it all, centuries of Venetian ambition hum softly, like an old lute string still vibrating. Venice wasn't just engineered physically, it engineered itself politically. What began as a desperate swamp settlement gradually morphed into one of the most stable, cunning, and surprisingly, bureaucratic republics in Europe. You might think political stability came from wise rulers or clever diplomacy. Venice's secret ingredient, though, was something far more interesting. Architecture, because here, power was built literally. Let's start with the heart of it all. The Piazza San Marco. You've seen it, the long marble expanse framed by arcades, dappled with pigeons and tourists who've ignored every do-not-feed sin since eternity. But back in the day, this place was symbolic urban propaganda. The Doge's palace sat to one side, all pale pink, stone, and lace-like art, gently whispering, "We're powerful, but tasteful." It wasn't designed to intimidate like a fortress. It was designed to convince. Venetian power wanted admiration more than fear, which, considering their history of occasionally sneaky political moves, was smart branding. And next to it, the Basilica. Silver domes, glinting, mosaics sparkling, and a front facade so ornate, it feels like God was competing with a jeweler. Behind that beauty, though, was a simple message: divine sanction. The Republic ruled not by divine right, but it wanted you to think the heavens were sending polite nods of approval. The layout of San Marco is no accident. Every line of sight converges towards symbols of communal identity, not individuals. Ebente Doge, Venice's elected ruler, lived in a palace that faced both inward and outward toward the square, where civic life played out, and toward the lagoon, symbolizing connection to trade and the wider world. The Doge wasn't a king. He couldn't even leave the city without permission. His duties were ceremonial, his freedom restricted, his image carefully choreographed. The government knew better than to trust one man with too much autonomy. especially in a place that had mastered the art of balancing on water. So they built a system that mirrored their geography. Flexible enough to move, rigid enough not to collapse. Layers of councils, senates, committees, each designed to offset another's power. Like the piles beneath the city, their politics stood because no single column bore the strain. Now, beneath those marble floors, there was paperwork. Endless paperwork. Venice thrived on records. Trade manifests, civic ordinances, diplomatic letters, stored into famous archivio di Stato. Even their bureaucracy was a kind of quiet engineering. Data management in a pre-digital world. It sounds dull, but it worked beautifully. A merchant could die in Alexandria, and 2 weeks later, clerks in Venice would adjust his accounts as if he'd just taken a long lunch. The flow of information was just as finely tuned as the flow of water. This precision bled into urban design. Districts were mapped according to function. Glassmakers in Murano, shipbuilders in the arsenal, bankers near Rio. The city breathed efficiency. Lightly chaotic, yes, but organized chaos, which is arguably more Venetian than chaos itself. Speaking of Rialto, that bridge isn't just a postcard staple. It's a monument to commerce, disguised as an architectural daydream. Before the current stone version appeared in the 16th century, the bridge had existed as wood for centuries, rebuilt, burned, collapsed, but always reborn. It symbolized one thing: that trade was Below it, the market thrummed with spices, silks, and the kind of extravagant accounting schemes that would make Wall Street blush. Trade financed the Republic's art, architecture, and naval dominance. Venice engineered its wealth just as carefully as it did its foundations, and that wealth, in turn, engineered its government, a delicate equilibrium between the merchant elite, the patrician families, and the broader populace. Everyone had a stake, though not everyone had a say. Venetian democracy was selective, but it sold the illusion of participation masterfully. The city's hydrology influenced more than architecture. It influenced behavior. When you live surrounded by water, secrecy becomes second nature. Conversations traveled quietly down narrow corridors and over bridges where sound didn't carry far. Politics here was whispered, never shouted. Even the famous Council of Ten, often dramatized as this shadowy, scheming cabal, functioned less like villains and more like state engineers, quiet fixers maintaining equilibrium. Their justice was swift, their faces unseen, their archives precise. They kept the Republic from capsizing by design, by fear, and by paperwork. Occasionally sprinkled with anonymous denunciations slipped into carved letterboxes shaped like lion heads, because Venice loved formality, even in espionage. This merging of political and architectural flair turned the city itself into a performance. Official ceremonies flowed through canals like waterborne parades. The most famous was the Marriage of the Sea, where the Doge sailed out to the Adriatic and tossed a gold ring into the waves, declaring ownership, or maybe partnership. It was a display of engineering symbolism. The sea as bride, the city as husband, both locked in eternal, slippery matrimony. It sounds grandiose, but it worked. Every ritual reaffirmed the invisible systems beneath those careful checks, balances, and hydraulic metaphors that kept the Republic from either drowning in tyranny or drying into anarchy. And somehow all of this, the politics, the architecture, the pageantry, kept Venice peaceful for nearly a millennium. While kingdoms around it tore themselves apart in dynastic hysterics, Venice hummed along like a steady tide. Its wars were mostly fought by professionals, its wealth distributed through trade networks, and its self-image polished daily, like a glass bead. There were cracks, of course. Corruption flowed as easily as canal water. Oligarchic cliques tightened their grip, and by the late Renaissance, the stability had started to fossilize. Venice became more statue than organism, perfectly balanced, perfectly stagnant. But even in decline, the city refused to collapse into chaos. When Napoleon finally arrived in 1797, he didn't overthrow a monarchy or crush a rebellion. He simply brushed away a system that had already quietly decided it was tired. Maybe that's Venice's strangest achievement. Not survival against the odds, but endurance through style. A political system that turned maintenance into philosophy, defense into art, and bureaucracy into poetry carved in marble. You can almost feel it as you wander through those echoing corridors of the Doge's palace. The faint scent of damp plaster, the murmur of footsteps that once planned the fate of empires, and the sense that everything, absolutely everything, was designed to hold itself upright just long enough to seem immortal. So let's ease out for tonight. Our next drift will move from power to beauty. How Venetian architecture evolved into visual music. How painters like Titian and Tintoretto turned the city's glow into brushwork, and how urban design itself became an artwork of light and reflection. The lagoon's quiet. The city waits. We'll float there next time. Hey there again. Night travelers, if you're still awake, congratulations. You've officially outlasted 1,000 years of Venetian history. Tonight, we're floating deeper into the soul of the city. The paint, the marble, the sound of footsteps on wet stone. Because what Venice built wasn't just a city, it was a mood, a kind of glowing melancholy suspended above a lagoon. And honestly, that might be the city's finest engineering trick of all. By the time the Renaissance reached full bloom, Venice was already an old soul. While Florence was busy rediscovering geometry and Rome was measuring domes, the Venetians were more concerned with how light danced on water. Their architecture followed suit, ornamented, soft-edged, more shimmer than structure. Walk or glide through the canal at dusk, and you'll see what they meant. The facades don't dominate the view, they dissolve into it. Every reflection is a double, every window a ripple. Venetian design wasn't built for permanence, it was built for the way evening light feels when it touches polished stone. The architects even had a formula for that feeling. Color, texture, repetition, and just enough symmetry to look deliberate. Columns and balconies line palazzi not for defense, but for display. The phrase facade culture could have been invented here, except they would have found it too blunt, because in Venice, surfaces libet poetically. Nowhere is that clearer than in the palazzi. Take the Codoro, the Golden House. Its facade, once literally gilded. Or the Palazzo Contarini, del Bovolo, with its strange snail-shell staircase that climbs upward like someone decided function was boring. Each building is like a subdued peacock, elegant, colorful, and entirely unnecessary, yet somehow indispensable. But underneath all that beauty was obsession control through aesthetics. The city may look like chaos, but there's method in its madness. No building could exceed a certain height. Walls lined up with canals to create optical rhythms. Even colors were regulated through guilds and family pride. It's as if the Venetians decided the entire city would behave like a painting perfectly composed, eternally mid-sunset. Speaking of paintings, let's float to that side of the story. Because once Venice mastered the art of building, it started painting the light itself. Venetian art had one advantage no other city could match. Water. It gave everything a glow, a constant shimmer of reflected illumination. Artists soaked that up, like bread in olive oil. Bellini softened faces like they were sculpted out of candlelight. Giorgione turned landscapes into daydreams with no clear horizon. And then came Titian, who didn't really paint so much as melt color across the canvas. His reds were infamous, so deep they looked alive, so rich they made rival cities jealous. Venetian color wasn't symbolic, it was sensual. Florence gave the world linear perspective. Venice gave it atmosphere. One drew lines, the other drew mood. Even Tintoretto, the dramatist of them all, filled his canvases with streaks of light that looked less like divine revelation and more like electricity, which, honestly, feels accurate for a city constantly trapping sky and water. And while the painters were quietly setting Europe's visual language on fire, the city's music was echoing through vaulted churches. St. Mark's Basilica became a sonic laboratory. Musicians positioned choirs on opposite balconies, so they could sing in surround sound centuries before anyone thought of speakers. The result was Venetian Palicoro Sleepless, drifting harmony that sounded exactly like the city looked. Magnificent, blurred at the edges, and slightly too beautiful to be real. From these echoes came Vivaldi, the so-called Red Priest, who turned seasonal weather and Venetian rhythm into symphony. His violins seemed to breathe salt air. It is impossible to listen to his music and not imagine yourself gliding between dusk-lit canals as small waves fold against a gondola's hull. But even as all this beauty unfurled, something underneath was dimming. Venice had peaked artistically unrivaled, politically waning. The discoveries of the New World shifted trade toward the Atlantic, bypassing the Adriatic altogether. The city that once ruled the spice routes found itself quietly retired from global relevance, a glittering relic floating gently into decline. And it declined with remarkable Grezno revolutions. No fires, no grand just a slow fading, like color running out of silk. The palaces remained. The money did not. Canals that once ferried merchants now carried nostalgia. By the 18th century, Venice had become a museum of itself, half dream, half ruin, serenely self-aware that it was too beautiful to modernize. Visitors like Goethe and Byron arrived to sigh about its decadence. Painters like Canaletto preserved it in exquisite detail, freezing the moment before decay became obvious. Even as the paint peeled, Venice learned to turn decay into an aesthetic. Flaking plaster became texture. Sinking foundations became poetry. And here's the funny thing. Maybe that's the point. Every city tries to fight, time build higher, last longer, appear stronger. Venice, floating quietly on rotting timber, never bothered pretending victory was possible. It built to be temporary and somehow lasted longer than most empires. Its engineering was defiance. Its beauty was acceptance. The two met halfway, just like land and sea. That's probably why Venice feels like a dream every time someone tries to describe it. It's not meant to be solid. It's a city caught between breath and water, art and collapse. The world changes around it. Tides rise higher every year, but Venice simply adjusts, sighs, and waits for the next high water. Survival through style, again. So, as we drift away from the lagoon for the last time tonight, the city lingers half real, half imaginary. The bells echo across narrow alleys, the ripples shimmer under the bridges, and for a moment, everything stands still. Venice doesn't tell a story of triumph or failure. It tells one of balance between decay and devotion, ambition and humility, mud and marble. Maybe the real engineering marvel isn't that Venice was built at all. It asks that we still can decide whether it was a brilliant idea or a beautifully slow disaster. And maybe that's what makes it so perfect. Sleep well, and let the lagoon dream for you. Hey, folks, tonight's story comes with a bit of mist, a few daggers, and a healthy dose of medieval overreaction. So, if you're tucked in, lights low, mind half drifting, you're in the right mood. We're heading into the hills of Persia, a long time ago before the Mongols stomped through, and before Marco Polo turned rumor into bedtime legend. Somewhere up there, on a ridge no army liked to climb, there was a fortress named Its name meant eagle's nest, because of course it did. This place became the heart of a group that terrified every medieval ruler from Cairo to Damascus, though, to be fair, most of those rulers were already paranoid enough to begin with. They were called the Hashashin, sometimes the Assassins. The name alone has survived almost 1,000 years, mutating into a word we casually throw around like it's an action verb. But their real story? It's slower, denser, and a bit sadder. Like most strange legends, it begins with a man who just couldn't let go of an idea. Let's drift first to the 11th century. Persia, at the time, was a chessboard of loyalties, dynasties, and general political exhaustion. The once mighty Abbasid Caliphate was fading under rival courts and more dynastically creative. In this overcomplicated mess appeared a man named Hashashin. Imagine him as part scholar, part schemer, part philosopher who never quite left college. He was born around 1050 in Qom, or maybe resources disagree, because medieval chroniclers were about as precise as modern influencers on dates. What they do agree on is that Hashashin was sharp, a meticulous organizer, The kind of guy who could turn an abstract religious argument into a recruitment plan. He began life as a Twelver Shia Muslim, but eventually converted to Ismailism, a smaller branch, centered around the idea that the rightful spiritual authority belonged to a living imam descended from Ali. This wasn't a safe career move. In Seljuk-controlled territory, being an Ismaili was like walking around with a sign that read, "Potential heretic and future trouble." And Hazen didn't mind that one bit. By his early 30s, Hazen had joined the Ismaili Missionary Network. That Awand proved alarmingly good at his job. Picture a medieval sales rep, except instead of pitching silk, he was pitching cosmology. His travels took him through Egypt, Syria, and back to Persia. Somewhere along the way, he probably met the Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir in Cairo, who might have impressed him or utterly confused him again. Sources are unclear. What is clear is that Hazen came back east convinced that if he couldn't convert the world, he could at least carve out a little corner and make it behave properly. That corner turned out to be Alamat. Now, Alamat was one of those strongholds every conqueror thought about capturing but reconsidered halfway through the climb. It sat on a towering crag above the valley of Rudbar, half fortress, half balcony above the clouds. And in 1090, Hazen somehow took it. According to the legend, he didn't storm it, he infiltrated it slowly, converting the local garrison little by little, until one day, the only person not pledging loyalty to him was the original lord. When Hazen politely informed the man that the fortress was no longer his, the poor guy looked around and realized everyone with a spear disagreed with him. He was even compensated. Nearly everyone in this story has receipts. From that one fortress, Hassan created something extraordinary, an autonomous Ismaili state right in the folds of Seljuk territory, and their methods of defense became the stuff of myth. Let's pause here, because this is where history starts blending with ghost stories. The Ismailis of Alamat didn't have an empire. They had mountains, castles, and really deep patience. Hasan's community was disciplined, secretive, and strategically impossible to siege. But they had another weapon: reputation. The Seljuks couldn't destroy them outright. Every campaign ended with startled soldiers realizing they were being picked off by individuals who seemed to appear out of nowhere. Political figures who plotted against Alamat often didn't make it to next spring. Assassinations became their psychological warfare. They targeted viziers, governors, and anyone broadcasting Anas Ismaili sermons a little too enthusiastically. Each strike was personal, rare, and deliberately theatrical, often done in public, sometimes in sacred spaces, always with a message. People started whispering that Hasan's followers were everywhere, that they could appear in any court, anywhere. No fortress walls or royal guards could protect you if you were marked. A nightmare tailor-made from medieval paranoia. Now, about that name, it comes from Arabic, and for centuries, everyone argued what it originally meant. Some said it referred to hashish, implying the assassins used the drug before missions to inspire ecstatic visions. That's the fashionable version popularized by crusaders, and later by Marco Polo, who never met an exaggeration he didn't like. But the word might just as well have meant outlaws, followers of Hasan, or something less scandalous that annoyed early chroniclers. Whatever the case, the hashish story stuck because it made good gossip. Europeans loved Itamaji, mysterious Eastern killers, high on sacred herbs, doing the bidding of a fanatical old man in a hidden garden. It practically wrote itself. The real Hasan-I Sabah, however, was the least decadent visionary you could find. He lived like a monk, no wine, no luxuries, just endless study and suspicion. Even his followers joked. He never smiled. According to one story, he executed his own son for breaking Islamic law by drinking. Whether true or not, it cemented his image: pure devotion, zero tolerance. Under him, Alamat turned into a strange hybrid. Part monastery, part research station, part fortress. The scholars there studied astronomy, theology, mathematics, and defensive architecture, all while perfecting the art of psychological warfare. Hasan used the idea of invisibility better than any army. By convincing enemies that his followers could strike anywhere, he didn't need large forces. Fear did the work for him. Diplomats suddenly wanted treaties. Governors reconsidered policies. the Seljuks discovered that one dead vizier could inspire 10 years of political silence. Aeon Sedoble wrote, "Nothing is true. Everything is permitted." At least, that's what a later chronicler claimed. The line probably isn't authentic, but it fits how Europeans imagined them: philosophical anarchists in turbans, floating somewhere between mystics and Of course, reality was more bureaucratic. The Nizari Ismailisas, they called themselves, built a network of mountain fortresses across Persia and Syria, each one connected by coded correspondence and a hierarchy of missionaries known as Ds. It was an early experiment in decentralized governance. While surrounding states burned through dynastic drama, the Ismailis quietly maintained their own They handled local trade, issued coins, educated scholars. They even had female missionaries, an unusual detail nearly erased by macho chroniclers later, but they were perpetually at risk. Hazen and his followers knew that longevity meant secrecy, precision, and no unnecessary wars. So they played the long game, negotiating with whoever happened to be nearby, whether a Seljuk emir or a passing crusader noble who didn't want another headache in the mountains. Survival was their ultimate doctrine. Hassan I-Sabah died around 1124. After nearly 35 years ruling from Aleppo, he left behind not a sprawling empire, but a functioning system that endured long after his death. His management style could be summarized as absolute control, distributed fear, quiet order. He was succeeded by a line of imams and local leaders who kept the network alive. And with every passing generation, the myth of the assassins grew wilder. To the Crusaders, they were lunatics who killed kings for money. To Islamic chroniclers, they were heretics, luring young men with illusions. To the Ismailis themselves, they were disciplined seekers, preserving truth in a hostile world. 3 versions, all incompatible, all partially true. Let's float for a moment through how those illusions started crystallizing. By the 12th century, the Crusades had brought European knights face to face with the Islamic world and, as usual, everyone involved completely misunderstood the other. Tales of the assassins spread westward like stories at a medieval campfire. Niccolo of Damascus might tell one version to Conrad of incidentally, became their most famous victim in 1192. Assassins killed him in broad daylight, shortly after he'd been elected king of Jerusalem. The operation was elegant and suicidal. The 2 men who stabbed him were caught, but didn't resist. The message landed, and every European chronicler scribbled some version of untraceable killers, wide lies. From that point, anything remotely sneaky got blamed on the assassins. A poisonous letter must be them. A sleeping vizier found missing. Definitely them. A scandalous rumor. Probably Hazen's ghost. They became folklore while still alive. As the centuries passed, their enemies multiplied. The Abbasids hated them. The Seljuks despised them. The Crusaders feared them. They managed precarious peace agreements, often working as brokers or intelligence agents in conflicts where survival meant knowing everyone's secrets. For over a century, the mountain strongholds of the Nizari kept watch, while dynasties rose and fell below. But by the early 1200s, a new storm was forming far beyond their control, a horseborn one named the Mongols. And the Mongols, famously, weren't impressed by legends. That is where we drift to next time, how the world's most feared secret order met the unstoppable machine of conquest and what survived under the ruble. For now, let's close the gates of Alamat. Let the torches burn low, and listen to the wind move through those old stone corridors. The mountain sleeps, for now. Hey, Evergwine. Welcome back to the quiet side of the 11th century's hangover the 13th. Tonight, we're climbing back up into the mountains, to those once impregnable castles of the Nizari BT's Point. You can almost imagine the air around Alamat crackling with rumor. For decades, everyone had been whispering about the assassins, their deadly precision, their secret gardens, their mysterious rituals. But all legends have an expiry date, and this one's came with hoofbeat. It started far to the east, with Genghis Khan and his many, many descendants. They'd already flattened more geographies than anyone thought possible, combining speed, fury, and spreadsheets worth of logistics. By 1250, their empire stretched from China to Hungary. They didn't need myths, they made them, and somewhere on their list of annoying territories that need immediate crushing appeared the small, stubborn fortresses of the Nizari. By now, Hassan Saba was long dead. He'd left strict governance behind, but the centuries had softened discipline. The Ismaili network had passed through several leaders. Kia Denathan II, who apparently shocked everyone by declaring a radical new interpretation of doctrine, and ultimately Rukin al-Din Korsa. Rukin al-Din inherited a kingdom that was tired. The walls were still strong, the towers still impressive, but the world was changing faster than their mountains could keep up. Trade routes had shifted, neighboring powers had grown wary, and the Mongols were now not just a rumor but an approaching weather system. And in Mongol foreign policy, ambiguity rarely ended well. Around Erwu sent Hulagu Kongrandson of Genghis received specific orders from his brother, Mangi, the Great Khan. He was to march west, crush whatever resistance remained in Persia, and especially deal with the mountain sect that had everyone spooked. Even Mongol generals had heard tales about the assassins' invisible reach. Legends claimed they could infiltrate camps, poison wells, and kill Khans in their sleep. The Mongols, famously practical, decided to confirm these rumors by stamping them out entirely. Hulagu's army rumbled toward Persia like an avalanche that had just learned project management. Tens of thousands of cavalry, siege engines, Chinese engineers. Against that, Alamat and its network of fortresses looked heroic but hopeless. You can almost see Rukin al-Din Korsa standing on the walls, realizing that centuries of fear-based diplomacy were finally meeting an enemy too big to scare. Still, he tried negotiation. Reports differ. Some say he sent envoys. Others, that he tried to submit gracefully. Perhaps he hoped the Mongols would accept tribute or a promise of loyalty. But Hulagu wasn't in the mood for symbolic surrender. He demanded complete submission. Every fortress surrendered, every tower unmanned. It was a disarmament decree carved into destiny. Rukin al-Din hesitated. Can you blame him? The fortresses were the Ismaili heartbeat. Abandoning them meant unwinding everything Hassan Saba had built. Secrecy, safety, sovereignty. But hesitation meant annihilation. So he began the unimaginable, ordering his own citadels to surrender. One by one, across Persia, the Nizari strongholds sent envoys, opened gates, and handed over keys. Some held out longer than others. But Alamut itself, their symbol, finally fell in December 1256. Let's pause there. Picture that moment. Alamut had stood for nearly 2 centuries. The Eagle's Nest, famed for its views and equally famous paranoia, had weathered sieges that broke armies. But the Mongols brought a new vocabulary: fire, catapults, and geological rearrangement. They bombarded the fortress 4 days, until walls cracked like brittle shells. When the Nizari finally surrendered, Hulagu spared almost no one. Chroniclers describe libraries burned, scholars executed, and walls reduced to rubble. Even the famed Library of Alamut, rumored to contain the knowledge of centuries' astronomy, philosophy, secret treatises, was gone. It's probably romanticizing to call it the Alexandria of Persia, but the grief still fits. The destruction was methodical. Mongol campaigns didn't just conquer, they erased. It wasn't personal, it was procedure. Rukin al-Din Korsa was treated politely for a moment. Hulagu, proficient in the art of dramatic irony, received him as a supplicant, heard his appeals, and then had him escorted toward the Mongol court. He never made it back. Some say he was executed on the road. Others suggest he simply disappeared amid the bureaucratic machinery of Empire Building 1. More small name filed under resolved. His envoys fared no better. By 1257, the Nizari state was extinct, on paper and rubble, in fact. The Mongols considered their victory so thorough they barely bothered with garrisons. There was nothing left that could rise against them. But here's the strange part: the myth didn't die. If anything, it grew louder in the vacuum. Even as their castle smoldered, the idea of the assassin lingered, reshaped by those who'd never seen Alamut nor met an Ismaili in their life. European chroniclers, busy writing about the Crusades, could now safely exaggerate. "Ah, yes," they wrote, These were the men who obeyed blindly, who killed without mercy, who lived in gardens of pleasure, promised by a cunning old master. Marco Polo, passing through Persia a few decades later, lapped it up. He described lavish gardens, where the old man of the mountain, Hazen himself, drugged young men into visions of paradise, only to awaken them in stone chambers, telling them that obedience meant returning to that bliss. It was a great story. Completely unverifiable, but great. The legend fit perfectly with medieval appetites, mysticism, danger, a bit of exotic immorality. It turned a complicated religious community into a cinematic cult. Meanwhile, far from the myths, small pockets of the Nizari Ismailis still existed. You couldn't erase an idea that hidden communities survived in remote valleys, continuing rituals quietly under Mongol rule. They adapted, merged, and in later centuries re-emerged as new branches of Ismailism that still exists today, long after their enemies became history books. Their survival, once again, came not through force, but through flexibility. Hazen's old philosophy, in another form. The Mongols had won the Battle of Walls, but not the Battle of Whispers. Now, what makes this story so hypnotic isn't the destruction, it's what it left behind. Even centuries later, the word assassin still conjures the same shadow. Loyalty unto death, daggers in the dark, fanatical clarity. It's fascinating, because the original Nazaris probably thought of themselves more as defenders of faith than hired killers. But reputation, once weaponized, rarely returns home intact. We owe most of their imagery to outsiders, crusaders, travelers, and Arabic chroniclers who couldn't resist twisting reality into poetry. The Garden of Delights, likely a metaphor for a spiritual awakening, flattened into literal indulgence by gossip. The drug use, probably slander. The obedience unto death, exaggerated but rooted in their reputation for absolute discipline. Strip away the fantasy, and you're left with something much calmer: a community engineered around survival, secrecy, and purpose. Not so thrilling, but far more believable. Still, that ambiguity became their immortality. You can burn libraries and level fortresses, but you can't bulldoze folklore. It sticks, quietly embedded in the language. The word assassin outlived both the Mongols and the Caliph. It survived empires, revolutions, even novels. Like the Lagoon of Venice, the ruins of Alamat never really sank, they just turned into reflections. And the longer history gazed into them, the stranger and more alluring the reflection became. In the next part, we float into the afterlife of the Hashashin. Their legend drifted westward into Crusader minds and Renaissance gossip, reshaping into pure myth. There will be secret orders, confused monks, and a few literary forgeries, because no medieval mystery stays unexaggerated for long. So for now, imagine the ashes of Alamat glowing faintly under the moonlight, and the wind carrying stories far beyond the mountain stories that became, well, everything we still whisper today. All right, let's ease back into it. Picture those same mountains of northern Persia, but the air has quieted. No more Mongol drums, just mist curling around stone ruins. The fortress of Alamat is gone, but rumors have only grown louder. That's one of history's little jokes: wipe out a place, and you just make it immortal. Because even though the physical Nizari state was destroyed in the mid-1200 SA, their memory escaped. Traders, crusaders, and storytellers carried it westward, reshaping the truth with every retelling. Half of Europe came to believe that the assassins were a kind of mystical death cult, part monastery, part day spa, and entirely terrifying. The Crusaders were the first major exporters of the myth. They stumbled upon the Ismailis during their quarrelsome adventures in Syria region that hosted several assassin fortresses like Masyaf, Lamassar, and Kadmos. These strongholds stood tall among limestone cliffs, commanding mountain passes between Christian and Muslim lands. The Crusaders, armed with theological certainty and zero cultural nuance, didn't know what to make of them. They couldn't call them ordinary Muslims. They were too secretive, too independent, and occasionally too helpful. Because the assassins, being strategic pragmatists, sometimes worked with the Crusaders against mutual enemies. Yes, Christian knights and Islamic Ismailis occasionally teamed up for convenience. History loves awkward alliances. But cooperation didn't kill curiosity. It only made the Crusaders more suspicious. The first major European chronicler to blurt out the word assassini was William of Tyre, sometime in the 12th century. He described them as a certain sect of Saracens who obeyed their master unto death. You can almost hear the awe and nervous respect behind the phrasing. Later, a German monk named Arnold of Lübeck expanded the story into something halfway between sermon and thriller. He claimed they followed an old man of the mountain who could command absolute obedience through promised paradise. From there, the rumor metastasized through Latin Europe faster than clarified facts ever could. Every new chronicler added layers gardens of earthly delight, fountains of wine, silken courtesans, all allegedly part of the indoctrination toolkit. The logic went something like, if these men fear nothing, surely someone has shown them heaven early. And then came Marco Polo. Never underestimate one. Venetian with a good imagination and an audience who can't fact-check. Writing near the end of the 13th century, Polo described Hassan Sabu's paradise in detail. The old man, he said, maintained an enclosed valley filled with milk streams, honey fountains, and maidens more beautiful than humanly plausible. Promising eternal paradise, Hazen allegedly drugged recruits with a sedative. Polo called it hashish, taking the popular etymology literally, and, while they slept, had them transported into this garden. When they awoke among perfumes and pleasure, they thought they were in heaven. Later, Hazen had them brought out again, and told them they could return only through perfect obedience. It's a story that fits too perfectly, which, in history, is usually a sign that it's untrue. But it was irresistible, the medieval psychological thriller everyone wanted to believe. Polo's book spread across Europe, copied and retold until Hazen became the archetype of the manipulative cult leader. Suddenly, assassin no longer just meant killer, it meant indoctrinated devotee. A one-man parable about fanaticism. Meanwhile, the real Ismail Aswat remained of them, must have sighed deeply somewhere in the mountains they hadn't lost. For them, this narrative was absurd. Their faith wasn't about instant paradise or blind obedience. It was rooted in philosophy, cosmology, and coded devotion to the line of imams descending from Ali. They weren't drugging teenagers and running daydream factories. They were debating metaphysics and sneaking letters between strongholds. But Europe didn't want nuance. Europe wanted villains. And the villainous mystic worked far better than the quietly faithful mountain scholar. By the 14th century, the word assassin had become unmoored from history. It entered several European languages to describe any plotter or murderer working from the shadows. Popes used it, kings used it, playwrights used it. It was compact, memorable, and exotic. You could blame anything strange on an assassin sect, and nobody would check your sources. Even Dante sprinkled them into his Divine Comedy by casually dropping references to Saracen killers, already bundled into hell's more interesting circles. The Renaissance, with its love for shadowy mystery, lapped it up. Libraries filled with pseudo-Arabic manuscripts on secret orders. Trying to find truth in these sources today is like trying to find sincerity in medieval Tinder chat logs. There is intent, but not much accuracy. And yet, for all the exaggeration, some parts of the legend weren't entirely off. The Nizari Ismailis really did train loyal networks capable of precision strikes. They really did emphasize stealth and obedience. They really were governed from remote fortresses under an almost monastic discipline. It's just that the mystical embellishments, the drugs, the gardens, the hypnotic control were theater, invented by outsiders who needed a narrative device to explain devotion they didn't understand. We moderns still whisper about brainwashing or indoctrination. Back then, they called it paradise. Let's float a bit into the Renaissance period, when improved trade and slightly better geography made travel, writing Europe's favorite hallucinogen. Every merchant returning from the Levant carried more tales about the assassins each, claiming personal insight into their ancient orders. There were even rumors that remnants of the sect survived, quietly influencing world politics. To a Renaissance audience fascinated by alchemy, astrology, and esoteric brotherhoods, this was catnip. They imagined secret Ismaili lodges, preserving mystical wisdom suppressed by both Islam and Christianity. By the 17th century, it wasn't the killers that intrigued Europe, it was the imagined secrets of their philosophy. They became precursors to every mythic secret order that followed the Templars, the Rosicrucians, even the Freemasons. The old man of the mountain morphed into a symbol of hidden knowledge and dangerous freedom, someone who lived beyond dogma. Retrospectively, that's almost poetic justice. And naturally, because history has a twisted sense of humor, Western writers would later romanticize the same group they once demonized. By the Victorian era, the assassins were no longer just mysterious Muslims. In Mountain's they were tragic, misunderstood thinkers, lost to time and prejudice. Painters reimagined Hazen's strongholds as majestic ruins glinting under sunset. Adventure novels blended them with pirates and lost manuscripts. Even scholars began to note, reluctantly, that the word assassin came from a smear campaign that had done its branding too well. The myth survived longer than the empire, longer than the Mongols, longer even than the age that birthed it. And that's the thing. The assassins became less a historical group than a mirror for everyone's fears and fascinations. To their enemies, they were heretics and terrorists. To travelers, they were curiosities. To novelists, archetypes. To Hollywood centuries later, the ultimate stealth franchise. And somewhere, beneath all that noise, was the memory of Hashashin, intellectual, ascetic, probably horrified at all the dramatization. He wanted truth and survival. He got legend and merchandise. As the last echoes of Alamut faded from Persian hills, its myth found eternal life in art, literature, and language itself. The story of the assassins, isn't really about daggers or hashishit, it's about how memory transforms through misunderstanding. It's about the speed with which symbols replace people, and maybe that's the most enduring lesson of all. That history, left unattended, will always drift into storytelling. In our final part, we'll descend into the quieter afterlife of the Nizari Ismailis, themselves, how they rebuilt, reshaped faith, and somehow endured as a living community even while the world mistook them for ghosts. But for now, let's rest where myth meets moonlight and keep that faint whisper of Alamut floating somewhere in the back of your mind. Again. So far, we've seen mountains rise and fall, libraries vanish in smoke, and legends mutate faster than you can fact-check them. You'd think that by the end of the 13th century, the story of the Hashashin had ended with Mongol boots and Marco Polo's overactive imagination. Except it didn't. Because even as Alamut turned into ash, small pieces of the Nizari Ismaili world remained unbroken, too scattered to conquer, too quiet to notice. And they did what they'd always done best. They adapted. After 1256, what remained of the Ismailis went underground. Literally and in Persia, where once mountain citadels towered, surviving communities retreated into remote valleys of Daylum and Kuhis. In Syria, the fortresses of Masyaf and Kuabi lingered on a little longer, their inhabitants carving out minor truces with local powers. The Mongols, satisfied that they'd flattened the core of the resistance, lost interest in hunting every last follower. Bureaucratic fatigue kicked in a rare historical blessing. So, under the debris of their myth, the Ismailis did the only rational thing. They became invisible. No banners, no open proselytizing, just quiet endurance. If Hassanai Sabu's philosophy could be condensed into one sentence, it might be this: survive by subtlety. His descendants took that advice with almost spiritual commitment. Centuries flowed by quietly. Dynasties changed names faster than villages changed roofs. Persia became Ilkhanate, then fractured again. Syria fell under the Mamluks, who occasionally noticed the sect of the mountains, but never enough to exterminate them. In that long in-between, the Nizari Ismailis began rebuilding not as fortress builders or assassins, but as caretakers of knowledge. They held on to their faith, their imam lineages, and their secret correspondence systems. Where once Alamut's libraries had burned, new centers of learning sprouted in obscurity. They copied, taught, refined. Their theology evolved, focusing less on militancy and more on philosophy, spirituality, and quiet obedience to their hidden imam. There is something poetic about that transformation. The same people once accused of weaponizing secrecy, now cultivating it as protection. By the 5th-10th century, the Ismailis of Persia and Syria had reorganized into small clusters of practicing communities. Scholars speculate that the line of imams continued unbroken, though living often in concealment. The world had largely forgotten them, which was precisely what they needed. And, as with any group that disappears from written records, the imagination of outsiders continued doing the work. In West Asia and beyond, the word assassin persisted as shorthand for shadowy violence, while the actual Ismailis quietly tended farms, built schools, and maintained family networks stretching into Central Asia and northern India. Some of them migrated along trade routes through Afghanistan and Sindh, carried by merchants who blended religion with business as naturally as the old Silk Road had. That's where the next great chapter begins: South Asia. If you've ever wondered how a secretive mountain sect from medieval Persia ended up with a global presence, it stars. By around the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries, Ismaili missionaries, known as Purs, had carried their teachings into the Indian subcontinent. In Gujarat, Sindh, and later East Africa, they found small groups receptive to their poetic, mystical approach to Islam. Their message emphasized inner truth, compassion, and a direct relationship between believer and imam. And somewhere along the way, this new branch would come to be known as the Khoja community. The transition wasn't overnight. It was centuries of patient adaptation, shaped by geography, culture, and the simple fact that public survival was better than heroic extinction. The imams moved occasionally from Persia to India and back again, always keeping just enough distance from politics to avoid another Mongol situation. It was survival through invisibility. Again, then, in the 19th century, the line of imams finally stepped out of the shadows. That's when the 46th Imam, Hasan Ali Shah, better known as Aga Khan, born in 1804 and descended from the line of the Nizari Imams, he represented the re-emergence of the community into documented history. Politics being contagious, he found himself tangled in Qajar Persian power struggles, fled to India, and was welcomed by his followers like a long-lost heartbeat. British colonial historians suddenly realized that the assassin sect still existed, though under entirely different circumstances. The newspapers of the 1840s gleefully tried connecting him back to Hashashin, dusting off the same old myths about daggers and drugs. Irony. By then, the Ismailis under the Aga Khan were more bankers and teachers than bladesmen. But myths never check resumes. The Aga Khans would go on to lead the Ismaili community through one of history's strangest evolutionary arcs, from secret mountain sect to modern global organization. Aga Khan 2 and 3 modernized education, promoted women's literacy, built hospitals, and encouraged pluralism long before it was fashionable. The old fortress discipline had softened into something else: orderly endurance, anchored in ethics instead of Aga Khan III even represented India at the League of Nations and helped found international institutions. Imagined telling the Crusaders that the descendants of Hasan-i Sabah would one day sit beside European diplomats discussing peace treaties over fine china. That image alone feels like historical poetry. In the modern era, the Ismaili community has spread across continents: South Asia, East Africa, Canada, Europe. Their institutions emphasize culture, charity, and education. The current Imam, Aga Khan IV, presides not from mountains, but from global development projects and architectural initiatives. His foundation builds sustainable cities and schools, where the only secret weapon is urban planning. In some ways, it's almost funny. The same people once blamed for hidden daggers now build libraries and universities, honoring their ancestors' lost knowledge. Alamut Borned, but its spirit's devotion to intellect and resilience just traded stone walls for classrooms. Nothing, it seems, was wasted. So what survives of the original Hashashin today? Not the myths of paradise or hashish, not the daggers in dark corridors. What survives is their pattern, the instinct to endure, adapt, and preserve identity through silence when noise is fatal. It's easy to mock Hasan-i Sabu's paranoia, But maybe that's why his community still exists, when so many medieval dynasties do not. For all the legends, his lasting engineering wasn't in fortresses, it was in people. As we close this long, sleep-tinted drift through legend and ruin, picture Alamet again, not as fire and smoke, but as it might be now. Quiet rocks, grass between the stones, maybe the faint outline where towers once stood. The mountains don't remember fear, they just hold echoes, and those echoes stretch through history, through rumor, through language, into every whispered conspiracy and every overdramatic novel, all descended from the same small, stubborn circle of believers who refused to vanish. Their enemies tried to bury them in myth. Instead, they became immortal in memory. So, if your eyes are half closed, let them rest. The eagle's nest has landed us here, somewhere between silence and survival. The assassins are gone, but their shadow remains long, misunderstood, and strangely peaceful now. History, like them, never dies. It just changes disguise. Sleep well. Hey guys, grab your tea. Tonight, we're not following a king, or a war, or some chronically inbred royal. We're following dinner. Specifically, dinner as it wandered across continents. Because long before globalization was trending on social media, humans had already figured out how to exchange everything profitable and mildly edible across the vastness of deserts, steppes, and mountains. We're going down the Silk Road tonight. The world's most famous spaghetti of trade routes, the kind of highway that carried everything from silk and gold to gossip, diseases, and really confusing recipes. And in a way, this was history's first food festival. X with slightly more camels and way fewer health regulations. So Setherlin. Picture the sound of wind moving over endless sand, the tone of camel bells in the distance. We're tracing how flavor crossed from east to west, how spices changed kings, and how noodles accidentally became political ambassadors. Let's begin right where appetites met ambition, somewhere near Xi'an 2,000 years ago. The western end of China's Han dynasty was smelling particularly spicy around 100 BC. The Emperor Wu was busy sending envoys westward, looking for horses, allies, and preferably fewer nomadic invasions. What came back wasn't just geopolitics, it was flavor. Somewhere amid all that statecraft, Chinese merchants began pushing goods westward. Silks, tea bricks, porcelain. In return they got pomegranates, wine, and an emerging addiction to dates. Nobody can prove it, but the moment Chinese court cuisine discovered grape wine, probably launched 1,000 hangovers under the polite cover of tasting diplomacy. The Silk Road wasn't a single road. It was a messy web-pot mountain pass, part desert mirage, and part culinary experiment that refused to end. Every oasis became a crossroads where human appetites collided. Let's float west to one of those crossroads. You could argue Samarkand was an ancient version of a food influencer, only its filters were painted tiles and minarets. Everything that passed through Central Asia eventually passed through its kitchens. Mongol soldiers tasted Persian pilaf there, found it portable, and carried it across half of Eurasia. Traders rested under its mulberry trees with noodles from China and lamb cooked in cumin from the Middle East. Somebody probably invented dumplings here and forgot to patent them for future generations. The genius of Silk Road cooking was, in its portability, it had to travel as much as the people did. Salted meats, pickled vegetables, hard cheese, and dense breads that doubled as both plate and utensil. Dinnerware was optional, conversation mandatory. This was where geography dictated flavor. On the steppes, food meant survival: hardy, dairy, dried meat, fermented mares. Mill more on that, if your stomach dares. In Persia and Mesopotamia, food meant artistry: saffron, rose water, yogurt, marinated meats, and rice as a blank canvas for excess. In China, food meant balance: yin and yang on a plate, built into formality, but softened by curiosity. The Silk Road pulled all that together and shook it like a cultural cocktail shaker. Now, imagine the merchants themselves. After weeks of trudging through dunes, they de-rest at caravanserayas, imperial rest stops carved into sand and legend. You'd get one courtyard, 100 loud traders, 50 anxious camels, and one cook who somehow managed to feed everyone with what looked like despair and genius. Nobody wrote those recipes down, but the clues float through languages. In Persian, ash meant a stew thick, comforting, full of beans or lentils. Move it east through Turkic tongues. Andit bekomezash osh, orosh, which sounds suspiciously close to yushi, as in sushi when Japan later adopted rice vinegar preservation. The word alone crossed empires, simmering through centuries, and you can thank those cooking fires for one of history's most improbable inventions. The noodle. Noodles, according to archaeology, started in China sometime around 4,000 years ago, then spent a millennium sneaking west in various disguises. In Central Asia, they became lagman hand-pulled strands, floating in a peppery broth. To the Persians, they resembled reshter, soft and golden, often eaten at New Year. And by the time they reached Italy, they were claiming citizenship under a local name. Marco Polo supposedly brought noodles from China, but that version's about 80% nationalist marketing. The truth is, messier Mediterranean civilizations already had their own flat dough traditions, but the Silk Road certainly carried the idea of boiling flour into something slurpable and socially acceptable. So, yes, you could say the global noodle owes its existence to tired traders trying to repurpose leftover wheat and boredom. Of course, the Silk Road wasn't just shipping dinner, it was shipping identity. Religion, ritual, and recipe often traveled hand in hand. When Buddhism spread from India through Central Asia into China, it carried not only philosophy but dietary changes. Monastic vegetarianism followed the monasteries, introducing new protein, soy, lentils, and stricter meals without killing anything larger than a bean. Meanwhile, Islamic trade networks brought halal practices west and east, dictating what could be eaten, how it was prepared, and why goats everywhere had reasonable cause for anxiety. Belief shaped diet, and diet reshaped geography. Food, unlike armies, blended without conquest. Now, let's glide south into Persia, the empire that treated food as performance art. If the Central Asian traders kept things practical, the Persians went decorative. Every meal was a small architectural project. Rice domes studded with pistachios, pomegranate-laced stews, meat soaked in yogurt and saffron until they glowed like mild sunsets. From Persia came the idea of the table as theater. Wealth was measured in aromas and patience. Terich didn't need to conquer your kingdom. They just needed you to taste their food and realize resistance was futile. Silk Road cooks called it fusion. Historians call it adaptation. Either way, it made diplomacy edible. Spices are where everything spirals from survival into obsession. The Silk Road gave rise to what might have been humanity's first marketing addiction. Consider the humble peppercorn. By Roman times, caravans carried it from India across deserts to Mediterranean ports. At one point, pepper was used as currency. You could ransom a nobleman with a sack of it and probably improve his taste buds in the process. Cinnamon traveled even further, its origin hidden so well that for centuries Europeans thought it was scraped from the nests of mythical phoenix birds in Arabia. You have to admire the creativity of medieval misinformation. Traders weren't going to reveal trade secrets, so they let imagination fill in the blanks. Salt. Those salts was constant, the currency of preservation. Without it, the Silk Road would have smelled unprintably awful. Let's take a small dreamy pause in Kashgar, one of the busier crossroads cities where east met west and spices met altitude. It's night, the bazaars are quiet. You can almost smell baked sesame bread cooling in clay tandoors. There's lamb roasting, tea simmering, and a storyteller reciting some half-true travelogue to travelers in exchange for leftover naan. In places like this, culture wasn't just traded, it was fermented, like yogurt left in summer sun. Languages blurred, recipes mutated. A Persian pilgrim might trade poetry for pickles. A Mongol courier might leave behind a recipe for soup adaptable to any creature with legs. If globalization had a sound, it was the steady rhythm of knives hitting chopping boards behind caravan walls. It wasn't all comfort and commerce, of course. The Silk Road was also the world's most scenic petri dish. Disease loved a good caravan. Bubonic plague likely born along these same routes. made its grim journey west. So for every spice packet exchanged, there was also a bacterium-hopping continence. But Ebon Tot, in a weird labyrinthine way, changed food culture. Post-plague Europe rethought diet, sought cleaner preparation, and gradually turned hygiene into a thing. Tragic inspiration, but effective. The Mongols, when they came, briefly turned the entire road into their personal delivery network. Genghis Khan's empire connected the trade cities under one efficient and terrifying umbrella. His couriers rode with preserved curds, hard breads, and dried meat scalaries you could stab someone over. Yet very easy to pack. Ironically, this militarized efficiency helped trade flourish. Under the Mongol Yuan dynasty, recipes that once crawled their way west suddenly galloped. Dumplings, kebabs, syrups, and even frozen desserts crossed frontiers. Yes, frozen deserts, early sorbets, flavored with snow, fruit, and fear of the Silk Road, under Mongol rule, became a tasting menu without borders. Back in Venetian Europe, the results landed with extravagant confusion, new flavors, new textures, and a sudden realization that everything bland could be fixed by something expensive. Before long, spices had replaced religion as Europe's main reason for traveling absurd distances, and the world never really came back from it. We'll leave this first stretch here, in the glow of those cooking fires, and caravan lamps at that sweet halfway mark where the Silk Road is still alive, and everything smells faintly of cardamom, smoke, and ambition. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the lavish feasts of empires that grew off the Silk Road tongue banquets, Abbasid kitchens, and Mongol camps where entire philosophies of eating were invented between battles. So close your eyes. Maybe imagine the taste of something spicy and slightly mysterious. The road goes on, and dinner travels with it. Hey there. Let's settle back into the hum of movement. The night is calmer now. The wind's softer. We've left the grand palaces behind. No gold dishes, no jade cups, just the smoke of cook fires rising from roadside inns. The common heartbeat of the Silk Road wasn't emperors or traders. It was cooks. Forget the jeweled banquets. The real work of feeding civilization happened in the back corners of dusty courtyards, where grain met flame, and hunger transcended language. Let's wander there. Picture it, a caravanserai at sunset. Horses steaming from the day's march, camels folding down like tired furniture. Ebony traveler, Turkic horseman, Persian merchant, Chinese scholar, Greek stowaway. Ends up around the same stew. Nobody here cares about dynastic diplomacy. The only politics at the table is whose turn is it to stir. These inns were the arteries of the Silk Road. Built roughly a day's ride apart, they offered safety, stable space, and always food. Sometimes it was a feast, sometimes a gamble, depending on the cook's mood and the freshness of ingredients. Typical menu: bread everywhere. You could travel from Xi'an to Anatolia and never escape it. In Central Asia it was naan baked in tandoors, dough slapped onto hot clay walls. In China it became steamed buns, or bing. In Persia, flat discs perfumed by smoke. Each region baked what their soil allowed: wheat when possible, millet when desperate, and always tea or fermented milk nearby. Two was seat down. The Silk Road traveler ate for: function first, taste second. Weight had to justify calories. Rice traveled badly. Wheat flour compacted nicely. Spices helped preserve the illusion of freshness when ingredients had traveled farther than you wanted to think about. Lamb fat was the universal flavor base. In nomadic camps, mutton was currency. Herds provided wool, milk, meat, and social capital, which meant you didn't waste a single ounce. Every part was used: roasted, boiled, dried, fermented, or recycled into soup stock that never quite ended. It simmered eternally, the ancestor of modern broth culture. At night, you could almost map the trade routes by smell: cumin from the west, ginger from the east, garlic translating between both. And then there were dumplings. Somewhere in northern China or western Turkestan, nobody can quite agree. Someone decided soup wasn't mobile enough, so they wrapped it. One palm-sized miracle. Filling, transportable, endlessly adaptable. Rich or poor, everyone ate them. The Chinese called them juwazi. The Turks said manti. The Persians Italy, centuries later, reinvented it as ravioli and acted surprised. The dumpling was the first truly portable global language. Life along the Silk Road smelled like spice, fire, and horse sweat, an odd but surprisingly stable perfume. Markets overflowed with simplicity. Nuts, dried fruit, salted fish, pickled carrots, fermented tofu, condiments kept in small clay pots. Nothing wasted, everything reused. The Silk Road wasn't gourmet, it was ingenious. People didn't invent flavor for luxury. They invented it because life was short and salt expensive. If you've ever eaten pickles to make plain bread interesting, congratulations! Your Paleolithic Silk Road adjacent. The caravan cooks themselves were often wanderers, part merchant, part alchemist. They'd pick up techniques from each stop. Turkic roasting here, Persian spice blending there, Chinese steaming one mountain range away. They measured nothing. Recipes pass by demonstration, by repetition, under terrible lighting. A handful of this, until it feels right. The first globalized cuisine was built entirely on vibes. Staples varied by geography. Western China gave noodles and bean curd. Central Asia offered yogurt, lamb, and rice. Persia brought pistachios, wheat, and pomegranates. The Arab lands sent dates, coffee, and sugarcane, luxury disguised as sweetness. Out of necessity came invented tekumis, the fermented mare's milk, beloved by steppe nomads, warm, tart, fizzy, and almost audaciously unpasteurized. Every traveler tried it once and reconsidered life choices. Or there was curate pressed, sun-dried yogurt balls, so salty they'd last for months in saddlebags, easy to dissolve in hot water for instant soup. The medieval version of freeze-dried rations, except entirely dairy. Food wasn't just physical fuel. It was emotional insurance. Every oasis had its own specialty, proudly come to Merv. Someone might say, our melons shame the rest. Or eat in Bukhara, where plov was invented before humanity deserved it. Pilofa, pula, depending on who's marketing it, was the Silk Road's signature dish. Cook rice in broth. Add fat, meat, raisins, carrots, stir once, never twice. Perfection achieved. Caravan cooks guarded their pilaf ratios like bank codes. Taste-dildo. Let's stop at Kashgar again for a street scene. Traders dying of fatigue crowd the marketplaces, where vendors sell skewers of grilled meat, called kebabs, brushed with cumin and salt, roasted over open coal. Children hawk dried apricots and nuts. A man ladles orange lentil soup into bowls, adding a swirl of yogurt like he's signing a treaty. No tablecloths, no decor, just wind and hunger. But somehow it felt closer to unity than any imperial banquet. When strangers share food, borders melt faster than butter. Even the act of drinking evolved with the road. Tea on the eastern reaches, fermented dairy or grape wine in the middle, date palm spirits near the west. You drank what geography offered, then pretended it was a choice. Merchants drank tea like fuel. Mongols drank mare's milk like philosophy. Persians preferred sherbet, not the ice cream kind, but chilled fruit syrup with rose water and crushed snow stolen from nearby peaks. Imagine discovering refrigeration halfway up a mountain and deciding to put sugar in it. Travelers justified sugar intake by claiming it aided digestion. Medieval nutrition science was basically desert propaganda, but behind all the trade and invention, food remained a currency of trust. Sharing meals meant safety. Even enemies were fed once inside the tent. It was cultural law. On the road, refusing to share food counted as bad luck and worse manners. That old traveler's ritual has outlived empires. Break bread, drink once, talk business later. Silk Road, courtesy 101. Of course, survival sometimes meant lowering ambitions. Not every stop offered variety. In the high Pamirs, or the Taklamakan, your choices narrowed to boiled grain or boiled less grain, travelers seasoned with faith and resignation. Some caravans traveled with their own cooks as status symbols. Others depended on whatever stew the locals called edible that week. And nature, being predictable, always turned on them. A sandstorm could erase an entire meal before it cooled. So traders learned to eat fast, sleep briefly, and store calories like accountants hoard silver. By now, you can see the pattern. The rich dined for power, the poor cooked for survival, and in between came everyone else, inventing cuisine accidentally. No committee ever sat down to design the flavor of half the world. It simply evolved, one hungry night at a caravanserai at a time. A pinch of cumin, here, a tea leaf, there, noodles tangled with spices. Rice, merit, saffron, each moment of taste, crossing a border left behind, a permanent footprint. Without those travelers and their questionable hygiene, there'd be no spaghetti in Italy, no kebabs in Turkey, no tea rituals in Russia, no samosas in India. The Silk Road was humanity's most delicious accident. So as we drift out of those noisy markets, and into the dark again, think of them, the anonymous hands behind flavor. The cooks, the herders, the traders who turned the road into a pantry stretching across continents. They didn't build monuments or dynasties. They built memory through scent, the fragrance of cumin and wind, the sweetness of dates, the sharp bite of preserved lemon, all of it whispering a story of movement, resilience, and warm food at the end of dangerous days. In the next part, we glide into the symbolic and spiritual side of food along the Silk Road, how religion, ritual, and myth shaped what people ate, from Buddhist vegetarian feasts to Sufi banquets of charity, and how feeding the body became feeding the soul. For now, rest easy. The fires of the caravanserai burn low, and dinner's done. All that's left is the warmth of shared silence under the stars. Hey, again, wanderer! You've crossed deserts and markets. You've sat in banquets and dust. Now the fires are lower, and the talks are softer. This is the moment, in any long journey, when supper turns to silence, the space where food stops being about survival and starts being about meaning. The Silk Road was never just an economy of goods. It was an economy of beliefs. Faiths moved along with silk bolts and spice sacks: Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Zoroastrian echoes, each quietly reshaping the taste of the world around them. Let's start where silence and sustenance first met: the monastery. Imagine the Buddhist monasteries scattered along the trade routes from the oasis, temples of Dunhuang to the caves of Bamiyan. These weren't just religious sites. They were a full service. Rest stops for travelers, offering prayer, water, and often a bit of humble food. Buddhist monks saw cooking as an extension of mindfulness. Every grain of rice had its karma. Wasting it risked offense to both the cook and the cosmos. Vegetarianism became both compassion and discipline. No lives taken unnecessarily, no excess seasoned with suffering. Meals at these monasteries were ritualized: quiet, offerings, blessings, precise timing. The monks might share simple dishes: steamed barley, flatbread, vegetable stew, but each one served as meditation. To feed others was merit. To eat mindfully was gratitude. In their own quiet way, Buddhist kitchens taught the travelers of the Silk Road that even simplicity could be sacred. Farther west, Islam transformed hospitality into theology. In the Quranic world, feeding a guest was one of the highest forms of charity, a shared reflection of divine generosity. Pilgrims and merchants traveling between Persia, Arabia, and Central Asia often survived on this ethic alone. Caravanserais, funded by charitable endowments, called WAQF, offered shelter and food to the faithful and faithless alike. The meals weren't lavish. They didn't need to be. Bread, stew, salted olives, perhaps milk or dates for sweetness. Before eating, hands were washed, prayers were said, and every bite began with gratitude: Bismillah, in the name of God. Eating in Islam wasn't a break from life. It was part of worship's rhythm. The Prophet's traditions urged moderation, 1/3 for food, 1/3 for drink, 1/3 for breath. Its advice, modern hotels could probably use. And during Ramadan, the month of fasting, the road itself shifted heartbeat. Nights filling with the aroma of iftar meals, communities coming to life as fasting ended under fading twilight. The Silk Road after sundown must have looked like a chain of flickering lights, table-sized constellations where strangers became companions over bowls of soup. Zoroastrianism, older than both Buddhism and Islam, had already threaded its ideas through Persia centuries earlier. The faith treated fire, water, and earth as sacred elements, which meant cooking was an act of care toward creation itself. Keeping the hearth clean, avoiding waste, and honoring the life-giving flame became both hygiene and prayer. Their meal rituals survived quietly through Persian custom. The insistence on bread fresh from clay ovens, on pure water on herbs that symbolized renewal. Each Nowruz, the Persian New Year, carried echoes of that cosmic kitchen: green herbs for spring, sweets for good fortune, milk for purity. At every table, the line between daily life and the sacred blurred out gently, like steam curling from tea. And then there were the Sufis, the mystics of Islam, who turned the act of feeding others into poetry. Their konkas, or monasteries, were famous for communal kitchens that never shut. Travelers, beggars, poets, and royalty alike could come and eat, no questions asked. Feeding, for the Sufis, wasn't generosity. It was union. Every mouth was a doorway to God, every guest a fragment of the divine. Their meals were entirely symbolic. Bread for humility, salt for acceptance, sweetness for love. Some Sufi orders called the communal meal the table of truth. Others compared kneading dough to spiritual labor, folding body and faith together until both rose. From their gatherings came stories of saints who turned crumbs into abundance, water into comfort, and hunger into revelation. The hospitality of the Silk Road wasn't courtesy, it was creed. Meanwhile, far to the east, Confucian China added its own grammar to eating. Propriety, food, according to Confucian thought, was social architecture. It reflected respect, hierarchy, and harmony. Families arranged seating by seniority. Meals began only after elders lifted their chopsticks. It might sound rigid, but it built rhythm into society. Even emperors followed ritual tasting ceremonies. The first sip of tea offered to the ancestors, the first grain of rice lifted in silent acknowledgement of heaven's favor. Food made order visible, not by oppressing appetite, but by channeling it. Everything from chopstick etiquette to banquet layout was a reflection of cosmos through cuisine. Balance on your plate meant balance in the realm. No discussion of food and faith on the Silk Road is complete without mentioning the shared meal, the universal binding agent. You can trace this almost anywhere. The Christian communities scattered along the route, Nestorian churches in Persia, Armenia, or China, practiced the same logic. The Eucharist, or symbolic bread and wine communion, echoed a mentality the Silk Road had been teaching for centuries. Nourishment as connection, meal as memory. Every religion preached it differently, but they all seemed to agree food was never just physical. It was the shortest distance between humanity and meaning. You can almost imagine it. A Buddhist monk, a Sufi dervish, a Jewish merchant, and a Chinese scholar, all sharing bread in some nameless in-between dawn prayers and dust storms. Each blessing the meal in a different tongue, each taking the same bite. For one moment, belief harmonized into flavor. That was the quiet miracle of the Silk Road. Empires fought, trade shifted, maps tore themselves apart. But as long as people shared food, the road stayed alive. Eaton kept the world at peace when everything else failed. Maybe that's why so many legends about the Silk Road end with shared meals. The travels of Xuanzang, the tales of Sinbad, even the poetry of Rumi, they all treat food not as background, but as truth. The road's miracle wasn't that it connected cities, it connected kitchens. Every story of journey ends the same way: exhaustion, rest, and something warm in a bowl. Some say civilization began with fire. Maybe it began with stew. As we float gently out of this long narrative past deserts, palaces, and street stalls, the Silk Road fades into a quiet lesson about human appetite. We think of history as conquest, but it's mostly the story of people trying to eat decently. The caravans carried spices, the travelers carried recipes, and the gods, watching from their temples, quietly approved the ones who shared. So if you find yourself eating alone tonight, remember, somewhere, buried under layers of time, is a table that never ended, stretching from China to the Mediterranean. Everyone's still sitting there, in memory, monks, merchants, queens, cooks, passing dishes across centuries. That's the true banquet of the Silk Road.